Welcome to the second of 3 online sessions marking the 10th anniversary of the Centre for Critical Qualitative Health Research at the University of Toronto. Welcome longtime friends of the Centre, members of the CQ diaspora, and a warm welcome to all of you who are new to CQ. We're delighted to have you with us. My name is Blake Poland. I'm a senior fellow and longtime member of the Centre and chair of the organizing committee, and I'll be your MC today. I want to start with a land acknowledgement, and then I have a few housekeeping items. We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe, Wendat, Huron, and Haudenosaunee Indigenous peoples on which the Dalla School of Public Health now stands. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We'd also like to pay respects to all of our ancestors and to our present elders. A few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available to you afterwards. Slides will also be shared with the permission of the speakers. And we invite you to put your questions in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that as the session unfolds. And that is the place to queue up your questions, because it's too difficult for us to monitor that many things to see if someone has their hand up or they're waving to ask a question. So we're going to do it that way. We do have a networking and ideas wall called Padlet. The link is there at the top of the screen. We invite you to go on there and introduce yourselves and share any thoughts you have about what you're hearing today and through this series. We're also on Twitter and Facebook, and you'll find the full symposium program and registration link for the next session, which I'll say something about at the end, at the CQ website. The URL is down there below. And so today's session is organized by Pia Kontos and Alisa Grigorovich. And I'm going to introduce them briefly now and turn them over to you for some opening remarks, and then a very exciting panel that's lined up for you. So Pia is a senior scientist at the Toronto Rehab Institute and a professor in the Dalla School of Public Health. Alisa is a CIHR postdoctoral fellow at Toronto Rehab, and they're both fellows of CQ and both deeply engaged in research and research-informed advocacy that deploys critical theory, qualitative and arts-based methods to understanding and addressing issues of stigma associated with dementia care in community and long-term settings. So it gives me great pleasure now to turn over the session to Pia and Alisa.
Thank you, Blake. And good afternoon, and welcome to our session on the realpolitik of critical qualitative health research. Alisa and I are really excited to co-moderate this session that will provide an opportunity for us to discuss the structural inequalities and social conditions that marginalize critical inquiry in the health field, experiences with micro and macro resistance efforts, and how to more comprehensively mobilize the practices and processes that are needed to forge an interpretive space for critical qualitative researchers to not only survive, but to thrive in the health field. I'll briefly begin by addressing in broad strokes the issues that prompted us to organize this session as a way to set the stage for the presentations today. I'll then introduce our panelists, who will each present for 15 minutes, followed by a Q&A that Alisa will moderate. Interest in qualitative research within the health sciences and clinical health professions has expanded significantly over the last decades in Canada and internationally. However, such interest has not been accompanied by a shift in the positivist values and ideologies underpinning health research practice and evaluation. And thus, qualitative research continues to be regarded as scientifically inferior and is accorded less funding and resources than quantitative research, within academic, medical, and health sciences faculties, research institutes, and professional and political sectors. As Joan Eakin has observed, this makes practicing and teaching qualitative research transgressive. Exacerbating the devaluation of qualitative research within health sciences is the rise of the neoliberal knowledge economy, a set of ideologically driven beliefs about the nature and utility of the research process, which has intensified the importance accorded to the economic functions of knowledge at the expense of its social functions. This has fundamentally reshaped scientific knowledge production away from curiosity-driven research and towards outcome-driven, predictable, measurable, and commercially productive results. Such marketization of knowledge has had enormous consequences for all health research, but especially so for critical qualitative health researchers whose political and epistemological orientation and research processes are in opposition to such ideologies and instrumental aims. Finally, qualitative health research has also been influenced by the centralization of research funding via team-based health research grants and the requirements of funding agencies that such projects are interdisciplinary and use a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods or mixed methods. Such research designs are considered to be more satisfactory and cutting edge because they bring together different knowledge domains. It's also assumed that there's an inherent synergy contained in these types of research configurations and designs. Although these types of opportunities have been beneficial for some researchers who have been able to align their qualitative research interests with practical clinical and healthcare problems, with promises to improve healthcare, health systems, and/or health outcomes, they have not been without costs. Qualitative research within a mixed methods design most often occupies a marginal position, as it's valued primarily for improving quantitative measurement efforts or outcomes of biomedical interventions, and for humanizing statistical results using descriptive patient stories. As a consequence of this political and epistemological reshaping of health knowledge, qualitative researchers often find themselves working in potentially hostile or precarious academic and institutional spaces that compel them to work against the grain and engage in ongoing resistance in an effort to survive and thrive. Scholars who have written about such challenges have suggested, despite this cultural dissonance, it's possible to thrive by resisting the epistemic pressure to conform to the practice and standards of positivism. For example, Joan Eakin suggests that we can resist in our teaching of qualitative research in the academy by focusing on developing a supportive organizational base and strategic curricular content, as well as contributing to broader resistance efforts in research by building a strong community of practice. Kate Rossiter and Anne Robertson take a different approach, suggesting that we instead explicate the political and epistemological underpinnings of different types of research. This discursive form of resistance will provide the means for qualitative researchers to navigate their own positions and make choices regarding the direction of their own research agendas. While we agree that such understanding of the political and epistemological underpinnings of instrumental and hermeneutic forms of research is a precondition for resisting the demands of the neoliberal knowledge economy, to conclude with choice being the action that results from such understanding leaves unaddressed the layers of political action and activism needed to address both the tensions operating within the field as well as the forces or tensions operating on that field from without. Our suggestion is that micro-resistance efforts must be complemented with radical macro-emancipation, which includes forging strategic and tactical alliances with policy figures, media, publishers, and funding bodies in order to effect shared governance of science. Over the past 2 decades, critical qualitative inquiry scholars have made great strides in questioning norms of objectivity, emphasizing the complexity of social phenomena, and qualifying such inquiry as a moral as well as the scientific process. Such strides have been foundational to the interrogation of structural inequalities and social conditions that foster inequality, poverty, human oppression, and injustice. As Norman Denson has argued, there's never been a greater need for social justice, and thus at a time when critical health research is increasingly prescribed by market values, it's imperative that we collectively resist neoliberal accountability metrics and their consequent subversion of critical knowledge production. These are the stakes for critical qualitative health research in the neoliberal public sphere. Our speakers today will each be discussing their experiences with the practices and political processes that are truncating the methodological power of critical qualitative inquiry, resistance strategies of theirs that have worked, those that have failed, and strategies for how we as critical qualitative researchers can pursue transformative inquiries unencumbered by positivist disciplinary mechanisms. So it's my pleasure to now introduce our three speakers. Dr. Janice Graham is a university research professor, professor of pediatrics and medical anthropology, and director of the Technoscience and Regulation Research Unit at Dalhousie University. Drawing from bioethics, epidemiology, health technology assessment, and science and technology studies, she ethnographically studies the construction of evidence in scientific and regulatory practices that can compromise safety and efficacy in therapeutics and vaccines in Canada, Africa, and Europe. She's interested in how publicly funded innovations get privatized. She's presented evidence to the Science Policy Directorate, Office of Legislative and Regulatory Modernization, the Parliament of Canada, World Health Organization, and United Nations on open data, regulatory practice, and emergency response. Dr. Eric Michalowski is a professor of sociology and director of the graduate program in sociology at York University. He works primarily in the tradition of the studies in the social organization of knowledge and institutional ethnography. His past research has focused on the interface of public health and legal modes of governance, with an empirical focus on HIV criminalization. He's currently developing two small projects, a critique of thematic analysis and a qualitative study of the governance of urban nuisance noise. Most recently, he co-edited Thinking Differently About HIV/AIDS, Contributions from Critical Social Science, and Health Matters, Critical Social Science Research on Healthcare in Canada. He's a senior editor of the Canadian Journal of Public Health, responsible for qualitative manuscripts, and he's also a member of the CQ Advisory Board. Dr. Jennifer Poole is a cis settler to Toronto. She's an associate professor and co-graduate program director in the School of Social Work at Ryerson University, where her work sits at the intersection of oppression and mental health. While teaching and supporting is her academic priority, current critical qualitative projects focus on saneism in the helping professions, white supremacy, and discourses on grief and loss, as well as responding to colonialism in pedagogy and research. She is a TEDx talker, a knowledge co-creator, and as I understand it, a very silly aunt. She longs to write more, manage less, and is happiest outside, something that I think we can all certainly identify with. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Janice Graham.
I'm very humbled to be in this really quite accomplished panel, and I'm not sure I'm going to live up to what the rest of you are going to be talking about, but I'll try. I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm located in Mi'kma'ki, and that's the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. These territories include all of what is now Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia, and a large portion of New Brunswick. And I remind us all, and a reminder to us all, that we're all treaty people. In 2019, I worked with a number of anthropologists across Canada to challenge the removal of health research from the mandate of the Social Science and Humanities Research Council. We noted then that the social scientists had less success with CIHR for critically engaged qualitative research, particularly in international settings. CIHR had envisioned population research to include social, cultural, and environmental aspects of health and disease as one of their four pillars of research. So there was biomedical, clinical, health systems and services, and population research. And we sort of moved uncomfortably and continue to do so between, I guess, health systems and services and pop research. And we felt that critical inquiry was largely left out. And this was a very poor cousin to epidemiological, it was deemed as a very poor cousin to epidemiological approaches. Things, in my view, haven't really improved. Yes, SSHRC eventually did take health research back under its fold, but in the ensuing years, there's been a general decline in research funding in Canada compared to other like countries, and decision-making and strategic planning at CIHR moved into the hands of very few who seem to be more political appointments than advocating for the transformative possibilities that would include all types of health research, that would include us. Though perhaps this might have changed with the latest president, but I'm not convinced. There's been a fundamental reorganization of the academy that has whittled away academics in favor of higher and greater levels of upper administration, associate and assistant presidents and deans, human resource management, new offices of this management or that, new public management models. There seems, and this has happened in 20 years, it's just radical. There seems a proliferation of celebrity researchers able to speak to almost any issue, performing across the country while collecting speakers' fees. Research expertise doesn't seem to be a prerequisite. A new public management leadership found in its way into a new category of researcher that's now called the nominated principal investigator. This is in CIHR grants. More and larger grants with even more status and power in the university go to fewer individuals, and the building up of their particular research enterprises. Long lists of diverse co-investigators that are included in the grant writing stage are given the impression they give the impression of interdisciplinarity in order to meet the gaps in theory or methods that are challenged by peer review committees. But then these individuals disappear once the grant is successful, and the grant goes on without them in many, many instances. The CVs of these nominated principal investigators, the NPIs and PIs, continue to expand. They're growing administrative apparatuses, hire in PhD researchers who often make less than the admin staff. Professional service companies outside of the academy increasingly conduct the bits and pieces of research, the surveys and interviews, the social media analyses where real people and real world efforts can't be conjured up. The use of research projects to educate students requires waiting for their results and proves too costly for these research enterprises whose workers are already writing the follow-up grants for the next round before hearing whether the previous one was even funded. Endless addictive responses to research calls infects the ambitious young researcher in the new academy if they are to make their way through it. Another grant isn't enough, you need another. Quantitative and evaluative skills best fit in most of these projects, and the focus turns to evaluation, a word that has taken over the objectives and titles of programs in the academy, in the skill sets of purposeful, if not so meaningful, employment for the next generation of social science, where its theories, assumptions, and premises may go largely unquestioned. Departments don't have the luxury of faculty hires, but need technical workers who can do the labor demands of industry or government. Increasingly, it's hard to tell the difference. These industries and governments pay the temporary salaries and limited benefits through contracts. New hires of a precariat temporariness live on cash recovery from grants, government programs, and healthcare services. Bioethics, public health and epidemiology departments are made up of contractual and hires, providers for pay for service remuneration schemes, never quite full faculty members. These placements, not positions, are created from grants, targeting especially those with a toolbox of useful approaches needed by the decision and policymakers prominent in the strategic planning committees of the agencies, the funding agencies, the government, the universities. There's no time for generating theory, for asking questions about what's missing in the picture. Everyone is a pseudo partner in this top-down approach. The term collaboration and network are everywhere, but these are not real equals. Cochrane-trained librarians train and guide graduate students in health technology assessment and scoping reviews. PIs meet with them to go through what they've done and what they should do next. Methodologies useful to the sorts of positive outcomes desired promote the hiring in of particular types of professional services. Polling and social media firms are contracted out to do what used to be the research conducted by us. Survey companies or informatics analyzers are hired in instead of being part of the research team. The research team may not have conducted the interviews or analyzed the data. Efficiencies and costs of operation of these research companies temper critique over company profit margins. Grants are given to the clinical principal investigators, sometimes with little or no background in the social science or policy research targeted in the project itself, for what should be social science and community research. There are this consummate managers in this new management order of things, meeting the administrative checks for a series of prescribed goals to critically engage with real people to analyze complex real world conditions. They're not doing it. These worker researchers that are kind of hired in to do these little bits and pieces don't belong to academic unions. They may not have the rights to collective representation or the benefits of academic freedom. They're contracted to do the work. They teach on the side and hope for the new grant. At my university at Dalhousie, as a member of faculty in a clinical department, I have no collective representation. I'm not allowed by law, by Nova Scotia legislation, to belong to the Dalhousie Faculty Association, and that's as a full-time tenured professor. Still, the research of the people at this conference and in this panel is testimony that critical qualitative work continues despite a generation of targeted structural constraints. Some of us survivors may no longer suffer precarious employment. Others continue in the hope that brass ring faculty position, the chance to write your own grant about what really interests you, and it will come to life. And for some it will. As a country so wide that it spreads across 4.5 time zones, the loss of workshop grants really has fractured us. Those allowed us, and they brought them back, but they brought them back with less money than they had 15, 20 years ago. They allowed us to get together and exchange our experiences and strategically plan new projects. For those of us outside of major centers like Toronto, like where the Center for Critical Qualitative Research is located, there's this sort of being left on the margins. Your center is a particular source of inspiration and support, though many of us have been largely outside the loop of your activities and communities of practice. So I really want to turn to some hope, and I'm sorry this is not a particularly hopeful report. Qualitative social scientists need to address, and so I've picked out a few things that we really need to get onto, and Pia mentioned this, some of these. We really somehow, and this is really comes pertinent in my faculty, in my faculty in particular in medicine. We need to somehow be able to provide resistance and address the huge reliance by universities and granting agencies on the measures used for key performance indicators. KPIs are the central being of faculties of medicine. And certainly at my institution, the H factor, this high impact rating, is based on the number of publications and citations in a specific set of largely science publications, serves as the ultimate evidence of worth and value. Despite challenges, it reigns supreme, and despite 3 years sitting on a committee to try to change this fact, it doesn't seem movable. We need to change that. We need to figure out how we can pull a change to that. Not sure how. The challenge, though, is to come up with other metrics. Yes, metrics. It's hard to cross this line in the sand. And we're charged with negligence if we don't push our grad students to publish and to write grants, while at the same time we grapple in places like this with the development of alternative communities of practice. So it's just a constant sort of recognition of a sort of a schizophrenic, sort of a bipolar world of what we know really works, and yet what we have to tell our students and to do in order to survive. The dogma of commercialization has been completely accepted in the academy, reflecting on how horrified Banting was regarding the commercialization of insulin. A speaker at today's Royal Society meetings on insulin and diabetes said that commercialization is now a point of pride by scientists and universities. It's a positive development. And this is how it's seen. It is no longer contested. And yet we know that privatization and commercialization have never served public health or public interests. Yesterday, we watched ridiculous displays of outrage by politicians whose own parties participated in decade after decade of chipping away at our social safety nets, our public health, our vaccine manufacturing capacity. Fundamental free market principles are no principles at all. They privatize, they deregulate, they globalize. They've hollowed out our academy, its fundamental structures and domestic manufacturing, including for insulin and vaccines, which is my area of research. The social impact of the erosion and entire loss of manufacturing capacity in this country was evident to us all at the start of this epidemic. I've been writing about it for at least a decade, and still we had no PPEs and we have no vaccine manufacturing capabilities, though we have certainly expertise. SARS gave this country back in 2002 an advance to recognize the importance of building preparedness for emergency response that could take into account all aspects and was supposed to take in all aspects of our health and well-being to be able to respond to social injustices of structural inequities. Instead, initiatives were left on the table, disappearing in more austerity measures. The color of the boardroom remains capitalist, as my colleague Charles Menzies at UBC has tweeted recently. The gradual hollowing out of the things that we as qualitative researchers are most aware of, the vitality of a domestic work and labor force, public assets of manufacturing capabilities, has taken over 40 years and 2 generations to disintegrate. Banting and Best labs were sold off to Sanofi. Temporary workers in our government labs were left to set up skunk works operations to continue their critical work. So somehow it's up to us to envision the future, this new normal, but we need a place at the table, and we're still not there. I'm looking very much forward to hearing from my other colleagues in this panel to hear what greater successes they've had. I think I'm going to leave it at there, because I really actually want us to move into a conversation together. So I'm going to close this down now. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. And yeah, I really look forward to the Q&A to explore these ideas with you that you've raised. Thank you. And before we move to the next speaker, I just want to remind our virtual audience to post questions in the chat bar. So it's my pleasure to now welcome Eric.
Thanks, Pia. I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides. Just give me a second to figure that out. Is that working? Yeah, okay, great. Sorry. Okay. So thanks very much for inviting me to participate on this panel. I'm really delighted to be here today. We were asked to speak on the realpolitik of critical qualitative health research in ways that attend to the marginalized status of qualitative inquiry within the health sciences and that address resistance to that marginalization, both individually and collectively. So I've decided to use my time to pose a couple of questions. First, what do we mean by the term realpolitik, and how might the concept help our efforts to think about the politics of qualitative health knowledge? And second, what structural dimensions, or rather structural or institutional dimensions of practice within the so-called neoliberal university might lend themselves to a realpolitik of qualitative health research? So let me start with realpolitik. So as far as I know, historian John Bue's book, Realpolitik, A History, is the first detailed intellectual history of the concept. And in the book, he tells us that realpolitik is a fairly recent term that emerged in Germany in the mid-20th century as part of debates about international policy and the ethics of statecraft. The term migrated to the US, where it got taken up within registers of international policy, and also developed some of the negative connotations with which it's associated today. And those connotations include the sense that realpolitik is really a politics of accommodation or limitation that accepts power relations in a kind of self-promoting or cynical way marked by a cool realism. So qualitative researchers who support their epidemiology colleagues in team grants that include straw versions of qualitative inquiry as a way of trying to get ahead in their careers might be considered by some as an example of that understanding of realpolitik. In his book, Bue also argues that realpolitik is often used as a contrast term to denigrate so-called head in the clouds, utopian and idealist formulations of politics. Here, realpolitik is lionized as a kind of sophisticated practicality and worldliness against naive idealism. He does emphasize that the meaning of realpolitik has changed over time, but he argues in the book for a greater recognition of what he considers to be the original meaning of the term. And this is the piece that was interesting to me. So he argues that realpolitik in the German mid-19th century context really referred to a method for analyzing complex political problems that expressed an appreciation of historical context and a strategic ability to adjust to changing circumstances. So realpolitik as a method of analysis also privileged a pragmatic focus on the effect of ideas rather than their conceptual purity. So what we might take from Bue's work is a sense of realpolitik as a contextual, historically informed way of thinking about politics that is concerned with strategy and the effects of one's actions and proposals. So what might that look like if we turn to certain spheres of institutional practice? And I've just chosen a few. Those are the four that I'm going to look at. I'll see how much time I have. Okay, so the first one has to do with the social organization of teaching and learning. And this clearly is CQ's primary site of intervention and expertise. And I don't have much to say about it, except that I might encourage a broadening of CQ's role beyond this particular focus in the future. It's all fine and good to provide learning opportunities and to teach emerging scholars about how to do critical qualitative health inquiry. But from a realpolitik perspective, those efforts meet a hard and not so happy end if emerging scholars don't have access to funds to support their research or opportunities to publish their work in ways that give it its proper due. Let's turn to the next dimension, networking and relationship building. So CQ has had remarkable success in creating strong generative networks of critical qualitative health researchers. It has become a real intellectual home for generations of people who do critical health inquiry. And it's been a major accomplishment of the center. But I wonder whether there isn't an insularity to the networks that CQ has created and to its vision of the politics of qualitative health inquiry. CQ projects a vision of the politics of knowledge from a place that is very much located within the health sciences. And so, there have been times when I have had discussions with CQ fellows and researchers where it's almost as if they've forgotten that people do qualitative health research from institutional and discursive locations that are, far less concerned about biomedical, epidemiological, or positivist dominance. CQ largely ignores the practices, realities, contingencies, and political challenges faced by those who do qualitative health research outside of the health sciences, in, for example, departments of geography, sociology, and anthropology. And, I understand why that's the case, but I'm wondering whether that insularity is a bit of a problem. I wonder whether CQ's current relationship building, which is largely internal to the health sciences, might diminish or restrict its political imagination and its ways of thinking about the politics of qualitative health research. What might stronger and more direct forms of engagement with scholars who do qualitative health research out of the health sciences do, both for CQ and for those scholars? In an earlier presentation, it was suggested that the soul of qualitative health research is transgression. And I'm on board, that makes sense to me. But I think that is also an example of a formulation that is really internal to health sciences' visions of qualitative inquiry. Within the social sciences, qualitative inquiry has no special claim on transgression. So how might broadening the CQ network to encompass social science scholars operating outside of the health sciences shift how the heart of qualitative inquiry is understood? How might it contribute to a broadened collaborative exploration of what the current predicaments are for qualitative health research and what can be done about them? Okay. Funding relations. We've heard a lot about this from Janice, and I'll just maybe touch on a few points here. This has been an area where a number of CQ scholars have made important contributions and have pointed to a number of relations, primarily within the CIHR, that restrict the ability of critical qualitative health researchers to fund their work. And we all know of efforts to dumb down research proposals so that they fit CIHR review cultures, and of the cost of those efforts. But what other possibilities are there for a realpolitik response to the problems of qualitative health research funding? And I'm just going to suggest a few. First, I wonder about, again, how stronger collaborations between CQ researchers and social science health scholars might lead to collaborative projects framed in terms that might secure SSHRC funding. As Janice mentioned, SSHRC is opening its doors to fund health research, but health sciences scholars who are the lifeblood of CQ will have difficulty accessing those funds without stronger, genuine collaborations with their social science counterparts. Second, what might an initiative look like to invert the characteristic token or poor cousin status of qualitative health research within collaborative mixed methods CIHR funding applications look like? Why not get a bunch of CQ folk to gather some token epidemiologists to join mixed methods projects that for once place qualitative research at the center? And finally, might the obduracy of CIHR funding relations invite a departure from realpolitik into more utopian visions of research funding futures? Now, over a decade ago, with Roy Kane, I created recommendations for the Ontario HIV Treatment Network that imagine funding opportunities tailored to the realities of critical qualitative social science research. In the place of large multidisciplinary team grants and the forms of managerial accountability that they necessarily generate, we argued for funding opportunities with streamlined budgets that, rather than supporting extensive teams of interdisciplinary co-investigators, would support solo or small groups engaged in intensive research, analysis, and writing activities. Those recommendations were a spectacular realpolitik failure. They were interesting ideas that went absolutely nowhere and had no practical impact. So how can we begin to realize a vision of funding that works for the specificities of qualitative health inquiry? I don't have the answer at all. So maybe that's a question that some of our folks in the audience can think through with us later. My final point has to do with publishing. One realpolitik strategy around publishing involves critical qualitative health scholars taking up senior positions as editors within journals, as a service, really, and influencing their editorial policies and review processes in ways that favor critical qualitative health research. And that is precisely what has happened at the Canadian Journal of Public Health. through Joan Eakin and my respective efforts as senior editors at the journal responsible for managing qualitative submissions. What we've done over the course of a number of years, and with, I have to say, complete support of the board and the editor-in-chief, Louise Bovin, is to intervene in the organization of public health scholarly publishing in Canada with the view to creating a home for critical qualitative health scholars to publish their research on public health issues. So what have we done? We've created new reviewer guidelines that respect forms of judgment associated with qualitative research. We've built over a number of years a broad pool of reviewers with real genuine expertise in a critical qualitative health inquiry. We've changed our author guidelines to explicitly indicate that we emphasize theoretically informed critical approaches to qualitative research on public health issues. And we also curated and published a special section of the journal on qualitative research with an introduction explaining the approach to qualitative inquiry we were encouraging, and that included 4 examples of articles representing the kind of qualitative critical scholarship on public health issues that we wanted to see in future submissions. We also regularly approach potential authors and encourage them to submit to the journal. So all of this has been done so that scholars would not have to do the various types of gymnastics and trade-offs when publishing their work in mainstream health sciences journals of the sort that Pia and Alisa have described so well in their article. You'd expect the floodgates would open. So that my naive self, yay, we've done all this, it's great, everyone's gonna come and submit their articles. Well, it didn't happen. Our approach has totally not worked yet, or at least it's not worked yet. And I continue to get a steady stream of, we were interested in the perspectives of X population on Y issues, so we introduced 7 people and the following themes emerged. That's what we get. And so 2 related questions I think arise from this. What can we learn from an as yet unrealized attempt to intervene in the structural relations of academic publishing? And why hasn't this worked? So a couple of thoughts on that, and then I'll close. First, it may be that the pool of scholars that we are drawing on for submissions may simply be too small to sustain a regular presence for strong, theoretically informed qualitative research in the journal. It may be that there's a lack of clarity about what is or what is not a public health issue, which may discourage some researchers from seeing their work as a proper fit with CJPH. It's also the case that those who do critical qualitative work may be making publishing decisions that gear into the metrics of the neoliberal university that Janice had mentioned earlier. They may be unaware of CJPH, or they may prefer to publish in journals with higher impact factors, or in journals that are discipline specific, or that are more widely recognized destinations for critical qualitative public health research, like social science and medicine, or critical public health. Changing the reputation of a journal takes time. I kind of think we've done pretty much all we can do, but I'm open to suggestions. What may be required is a change of culture and disposition such that scholars make a leap of faith, choose to publish in CJPH out of a sense of commitment or responsibility to help build and realize a space that has been created for them. And I absolutely encourage you to do that. To that end, just a couple of additional reasons. This is my little rah-rah thing for CJPH. Reasons for you to consider publishing. It is Canada's national voice on public health research and practice. Our review processes are tailored to qualitative health research. We now have a 5,000 word count. For those of you who are concerned about impact factor, and we can discuss that, it's gone up. The new platform, since we are work with Springer, has resulted in an incredible increase in access to the publications included in the journal. This is very interesting. Most recently, we got a review from the Springer, and 2 of the 6 top downloaded articles in 2019 were qualitative studies. So there is a readership in CJPH for critical qualitative research. If you're interested, there's my information and a link to the journal. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Eric. I certainly hope that CQ fellows and our director and former directors in the virtual audience weigh in on the suggestions that you've made for CQ moving forward. And your experiences and thoughts about a failed structural response, I think, will no doubt prompt some good discussion. So please join me now in welcoming our third and final speaker, Jennifer Poole.
Thank you, Pia. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here this afternoon. I don't have slides, so Eric, you're a hard act to follow, and I really appreciate both all the speeches that we've heard today. So a few years ago, or over the last few years, rather, I've had the great honor of working with Doctors Corinne Hart, who I call the ringleader, Dr. Marcia Facey, who I call the seed planter, and Dr. Janet Parsons, the disciplinary weaver. We had come together originally as members of CQ's Joan Eakin Award Committee for methodological marvelousness in a dissertation, and we had fallen deeply in critical love. In 2017, we crafted a piece for qualitative health research called Holding Firm, Power, Pushback, and the Opportunities in Navigating the Liminal Space of Critical Qualitative Health Research. This polyphonic offering was born out of our care for each other, our love of critical inquiry, and our collective frustration at what we called the epistemological aggressions often visited on those who do critical qualitative health research. You know what they are, as do Janice and Eric. Those aggressions may come in the publication arena, where reviewer number 2 anonymously slams the research for its bias or, my favorite, lack of hypothesis, or when you're the sole critical researcher in your deeply positivist organization, and they see no value in what you do and what you believe, or the utter erasure of the labor you do to explain or support graduate learners trying to understand qualitative methodologies, or as a result of what I call the great wall of no that can be funding and our reality, a funding reality for critical qualitative health research. In that piece that we published, my brilliant colleagues and I went deep into many of those scenarios, what they feel like, what they taste like, and shared some ways for those who take up this kind of inquiry to hold firm. We talked about believing in the work, pushing back on that reviewer, making our work visible, as Eric just said, in many venues as possible, holding compassion for those who were trained to fear critical or theoretical qualitative research, and holding each other close through supportive experiences like this. We wrote, and I quote, "Holding firm can occur on multiple fronts. In our individual situations, whether in defenses, publishing, precarity, or funding, we have held firm to the principles of theoretical and methodological integrity. Holding firm entails standing our ground, pushing back against mediocrity, sometimes in a very gentle way, and at others more overtly. The art is to know when to do which. It also involves acknowledging and even embracing the emotions that often bubble up when we feel unheard or dismissed or invisible, and harnessing this as a source of strength, turning to face it. Pushing back entails more overt approaches in that what we do not apologize for being who we are. We do not try to rationalize our research on quantitative grounds. Pushing back means we continue to make explicit the assumptions underlying critical qualitative research. Our liminality offers us a kind of invisibility that can be a strength in that it allows us to educate and instruct from a place of quiet integrity and charming resistance. Sometimes it is most effective, we wrote, to speak softly or charmingly, but carry a big methodological stick. And thinking back to that work, I believe we are, in our own ways, and as we've already heard, still holding firm and attempting to push back with varying results. It's almost as if, though, that when one comes to the critical questions and the power of the methodologies that move us, that hold story carefully or hold up a mirror to a settler colonial or racist institution, for example, one cannot go back to those that don't. In my own collaborative work, using video methodology with heart transplant recipients has forever spoiled a survey and forever made a simple textual transcript just not good enough. And doing a critical discourse analysis of mental health in this province literally changed the course of my life, my health, and my work. So what I have found is that doing critical inquiry is almost involuntary now. I must do it. I cannot extricate myself. Like it or not, I'm always going to be holding firm. And this is all connected to epistemic justice. Fricker explains that epistemic injustice is when a knower, a holder of knowledge or speaker is disqualified by the listener through some kind of bias. The knower may be damned before they even speak or write, and often they are. Hermeneutic injustice is when a whole group of knowers, speakers, and holders of a similar knowledge are disqualified. Because those doing the disqualifying hold power they may not want to relinquish. And that power knowledge, as Foucault would say, is so very precious and capitalistic to them. And so thinking about our paper and many of the experiences critical qualitative health researchers have had may be framed as either epistemic or hermeneutic injustice. Indeed, this whole panel could be renamed the hermeneutic injustice panel, perhaps. Learners, researchers, educators, healthcare workers, all trying to justify critical qualitative research again and again. It's not about bias we want to shout, and it's not about tacking on an interview to your quantitative work. Holding firm and pushing back is, to me, all of these things. But I want to say today here that it also needs to be so much more. In the last few years, I've come to many different kinds of conclusions, including this, that while holding firm against external critique or disqualification, I need to be particularly careful that I never claim any kind of innocence. That is a particular kind of innocence that Rizak notes that white folks like myself are often racing to when they claim foul, or what I now call critical innocence. And the moments I use like a cool theorist or a sensitive methodology, or even stories about holding firm to virtue signal that I might be good people and may not have done bad things in the name of scholarly fastidiousness. Saying this out loud in front of all of you transports me back to when we presented our work at another CQ talk a few years back. I remember it was one of those few times we went on the road and over to Ryerson, egads. And after we spoke, there was a discussion about how different and dangerous holding firm may be depending on your identity and precarity. As Dr. Marcia Facey notes in our article, there are inherent risks in writing or providing feedback when you are precariously employed, and the work is partly yours. You risk being seen as overly picky or troublesome. And these risks, as our team noted, are even more for BIPOC folks doing this work. There is simply no equivalence ever between the slights experienced by this privileged white academic and those experienced by my BIPOC colleagues trying to hold firm or do critical qualitative health research or get tenure or finish the PhD or get into the program or get the article published or just get through the day. White supremacy has seen to that, and racial capitalism. And white supremacy is also seen to the fact that epistemic and hermeneutic injustice are not just visited on critical qualitative researchers, but may be exercised by those very researchers. Dr. Kathy Absalon, who is an Anishinaabe scholar and director of the Center for Indigeography at Laurier, has taught me a lot over the last few years. And one of the things that she says is that if something critical is still colonial, then it's not critical. And looking back at that talk a few years ago and up into this one, I think the issue is not just holding firm and not just pushing back, but holding accountable at the same time. Yes, I want to point the finger at reviewer number 2, but I need to point the finger at myself too. How can I teach and model a deeper criticality that holds everything up for analysis, including me and the often white space of critical theory and methodology? Is methodological fastidiousness a way I hold on to power and capital? How delicate is my research ego these days? And isn't the whole point to make health change, not careers? This to me is the realpolitik of critical qualitative research right now. Hold firmer to external critique by holding this work and this community accountable. As CQ has begun, hold accountable by deepening the emphasis on the critical and making that critical always anti-colonial and anti-racist. Ease up on the canon of white theorists, loosen the grip on the so-called right or institutional way to do things, stay true to the power of disorder, as we cited in our article, or the power of deeply, truly critical qualitative health research to disrupt ideas and practices that harm. Coming back to the liminality we wrote about in our piece, there is always the opportunity for deep reflection in between spaces, in between places and times. When things are not accepted, right, by bastions or by funders, things are unsure, for sure, unstable, absolutely. And they may also be oddly productive and clarifying. Critical qualitative health research is such a liminal space for me. And this COVID space has been too. As we live through this time, all this death, racism, change, loss, I ask myself, what is most important? What needs to get put down? What needs to come with me to the other side? And so, quite especially today, I ask, how can we hold each other closer and in accountable relation in our work, but also into the future? Critical qualitative researchers pride themselves on reflexivity, on hard questions and difficult conclusions. We can hold ever more firm in the face of external critique if we can bring all that reflexivity to bear on ourselves. And with that, I will end firmly and with time for discussion.
Thank you so much to Jennifer and to all of our panelists. So now we're going to turn to the Q&A portion of our session. And while you're starting to type your questions in the chat box, we have one question so far from Joan Aiken, who would like to ask Eric the following. She says, I love the idea of qualitatively centered mixed methods. Please say more about how you think of this and how it might happen in the context of the health research community.
Well, I wish I had a better answer. Then I'm not entirely sure what that would look like. I think it's pretty clear that mixed methods have a bad rap in CQ, but they don't have a bad rap everywhere else. And so there is an opportunity to look for inspiration at the practice of other scholars who do mixed methods, who have combined quantitative and qualitative approaches to inquiry in ways that don't capitulate to some kind of evil positivism or whatever. I think Bourdieu is a good example. And I think there are other ways that people who work in my department, we have many quantitative sociologists who do fantastic critical work. So it's not as though, quantitative research has to be some kind of horrible thing. And I don't think that, the models, whoever it was, Cresswell or whoever, the models of, do qualitative first to set up your quantitative survey, like that stuff is just crap. Just get rid of that and start thinking about it in a different way, such that there would be a kind of more epistemic equality, and to have it led by qualitative researchers. I think that'd be fantastic. And to try to subvert the history of the inequality in mixed methods designs in health, at least. So that's not a particularly insightful response, but that's where I would start.
Does any of the other two panelists would like to respond, or should I move on to the next question? I guess the next question, okay. So let's see. So maybe we'd like to start by asking all of the panelists to reflect on, so you're all seasoned scholars, and in recognition that there's many trainees in our audience who are only now beginning their careers as critical qualitative health researchers, given what you know now, would you do anything differently in terms of the choices that you have made along your career? Janice, I think you're muted.
I would not have come to a faculty of medicine. I was tenured in an anthropology, a sociology and anthropology department at the time, and I think that it has had enormous effect on the type of research and my ability to conduct the intricate types of research that I would have liked to have been able to do. The critical engagement. It was very difficult to do in a faculty of medicine.
Jennifer or Eric, would either one of you like to respond as well?
In order, Eric, so you go next.
Me? Oh, okay. That's a very interesting question. And of course, we always want to say no because we're so happy with where we are, right? But I was in the faculty of medicine and I left. Part of me wishes I had stayed longer because the grass is not necessarily greener on the other side. One of the things that you have to deal with in a social science environment is an extraordinary amount of teaching that people who work in health sciences don't even have you don't have any sense of it. Sorry, no offense, but you don't get it. So there are incredible limitations on your ability to do any kind of research when you operate in a service department of a social science at a university. I also kind of think that I wish that I had had more confidence when I was younger to pursue research that I directed. And I know there's lots of pressure on young emerging scholars rather to participate in any assortment of teen grants and join me for this thing. I wished I had done a little bit more to try to secure the types of funding for the type of research that I wanted to do, which would have been a solo-driven inquiry. I remember this aha moment, and I went to a talk, and it was Emily Martin speaking. She's quite a well-known anthropologist, and she started the talk saying, "My current project is," and I was like, "What? You have one current project?" And this is what I think I was still at Dal. And I was like, holy shit, there's no way. People are juggling millions of things and nobody has time to do any deep thought of any kind. And then she proceeded to give this extraordinary talk that displayed a kind of approach to scholarship that I had been trained in, I think, but I increasingly found very difficult to realize. So if I had maybe had more courage, more confidence, I would have tried to do more of that when I was younger. And yeah.
Thank you.
I echo that piece around courage and confidence, right? And it's, someone asked me recently, you know, do you have any regrets in your life? And I just have the one, which is that I didn't like myself more all the way along. And maybe it's, you know, actually more about like a radical love, which is accepting and forgiving and accountable. And see what I'm thinking about these days, right? And takes risks. And perhaps if I had been more rooted in that, then I would have been able to take more risks. So one of the things I remember not doing when I was, you know, 18 or 19 is that I was like, well, I'm not going to apply to med school. And I'm always like, damn, maybe I should have. And there's a part of me that was just, I had, because then it's the Trojan horse thing, that then you're inside, and part of me still believes that if I had just gone inside, then I could have popped out of the horse at some point and said, surprise, all quantitative research is canceled. We're now just going to do qualitative research. But I wouldn't have understood, I wouldn't have had that love if I had chosen a different path, and if I hadn't learned from some of the people on this call, and from, you know, some of the, many of the theorists that we've read. So sometimes I think I'm exactly where I need to be, making mistakes and owning them out loud.
Thank you. Janice or Eric, would either one of you like to respond to each other's comments or to Jennifer's before I move on?
I went to about 3 different places, and now I'm not there anymore. So no, this is really helpful, really interesting.
All right. So our next question is from Jackie Lowell. And so they say that they came here in the hope of finding an answer to the question, how do we as researchers remain outside of the capitalist con and yet still do survive in the full sense of the world, particularly doing research on digital health?
I think we expose the capitalist con at every chance we can and every opportunity we have in our writing and when we talk. We do diligence in its exposure, but there are consequences to pay for that. So surviving is relative.
I'm not sure I fully understand that question, because no one stands outside of capitalism right now. Like, there's no one. So I'm not sure what that space looks like or what that imagination is. I think it's about perhaps creating a livable life, within capitalist structures. And, I went to the university because I thought I could never function in the business world. And I thought, okay, I'm a gay dude, white dude. I'll be okay in the university. I'll be able to make it a decent way. I have half a brain. I can maybe make it. And then, as in the way that Janice suggested, the university's really changed a lot and has become this complete, center of academic knowledge production. So to somehow imagine that I escaped that is like absurd, and which I'm not suggesting the questioner is suggesting, but to try to think these things through, given the dramatic transformations that have occurred in the university, and how to develop a space of practice, a community of practice, as Jonas talked about, a personal practice, that somehow you can go to bed at night and feel okay about, I think is an ongoing challenge and is going to be even increasingly more difficult moving into the future. So I'm sorry that's not very helpful, but maybe just a few reflections in response to the question, which I thank the questioner for.
Jennifer, did you also want to respond?
Well, I agree too, right? We can't exist outside the capitalist con, but we can keep pointing it out to ourselves. We can know that it's seductive. We can know that it will come in different packages, right? It will try itself on us repeatedly in so many different ways. And just when I think I may have sort of outpaced it, it gets me again. And yet, how do we survive? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I don't know if we can survive. And as to Eric's point, I don't know if critical qualitative health research, will survive, as you asked. So I am, however, reading a great deal of abolitionist work. There's an abolitionist reading guide, which I'm slowly working my way through. And so I would say I'm a junior abolitionist, someone who no longer believes in the systems that I was so obedient to for so long. And there, I might, encourage folks who also might want to find some fresh air in that space to think about abolitionist futurities as perhaps a place of deeper connection around these issues. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay. So our next question comes from Laura. So her question is, so what advice do, I guess, all of the panelists have for more precariously employed critical qualitative researchers, those who are likely to never get a tenure-track position for a variety of reasons, ranging from lack of mobility to a collapsing job market, but work in health research instead? What kind of strategies or radical self-love do you suggest for those? And this is to all the panelists.
I can start if that's okay. This kind of question, Laura, was posed to me by some of the graduate learners. I'm trying to stop saying the word student, right? Because we're all learners here. So this was supposed to be recently about, how do we do this? And my response, which will never be enough, was that there's always different kinds of work. So for many, many years, I cobbled together, I was a precarious worker for 19 years, 20 years. And throughout that work, I had a system. There would be the job I took for my soul. There was the job I took to pay the rent. There was the job I took to do something creative. And cobbled a life together from all of that. And it was something that was meaningful for a very long time. It also didn't lift me out of precarity in any particular way. So hence the incompleteness of the response. But I think what I'm trying to say is just to know that even when you are less precarious, perhaps financially, right? And you don't have to take a job that leaves a bitter aftertaste in your mouth, or you think you haven't taken a job that leaves a bitter aftertaste in your mouth. It may be that job changes so dramatically, as Janice has spoken to, that you wish you were not bound up in it in the first place. And that lack of precarity becomes the thing that is binding you. And I find myself in that place these days. So I'll end there.
So another question that's to all of the panelists. So all of you have done really a beautiful job of identifying what are the issues and your experiences with different resistance strategies, some more successful than others. So moving forward, because you've all talked about resistance, where do you think we need to focus our resistance efforts? Do you have any thoughts as to kind of how best to do this?
I'll speak to this. I feel a bit of a hypocrite here because I think for your heart and soul, I think you need to focus on local community engagements and activisms and engagements more than anything else. I think that's where you can get lifeblood back and exchange and just really feel it in the moment. Though that can be also incredibly frustrating and sometimes even violent. And that said, I'm finding that as I'm coming to the end of my career, that the greatest impact I think that my research might be having is with a community of interdisciplinary, like other people who actually have a skill set that I don't have on my own. I'm not, although I work in regulatory cultures and I'm not particularly adept in the communication or the feeling comfortable in those places. And I now work with some people who are the front people for all of that work, and they can do it. And my work gets far further traction when other people say it and do it. That's just the way it is, I think. So I'm sort of learning that somehow that there's sort of ways of working with people with incredibly different skill sets that actually carries our work into praxis.
Maybe I could say something to this question, which is asking about where to center strategies of resistance, and I'm not sure there's any singular place to locate those strategies. But one of the issues that I think is important to address, and it's being touched on by other speakers, is the affective economy produced by the sort of so-called neoliberal university, which emphasizes hyper-individualism, atomism, working constantly, produces a sense of guilt that you've never accomplished enough, a lot of competition amongst yourself and others, and a kind of hyper bean counting for understanding what's valuable in the world and what's valuable about your work. I see this happening. It used to be that publications was an important measure of your scholarly activity, and it was always reduced to how many. And what I'm seeing now is it's not even that. It's now how much money you pull into the institution and the size of your research grants. I think all of this stuff has to be resisted at a kind of level of producing community. And that's where I think CQ is such an extraordinary resource to create that type of community, of resisting this type of way of thinking about who the self of the academic is and who the scholar has become. Somebody who just gives only cares about the next output, the next grant, the next whatever it is that puts something on their CV that can demonstrate to their department head or to their dean or whoever that they're a productive scholar. All that stuff, and that needs to be led by people who are in positions of secure academic positions, who can change the culture by creating new metrics, new forms of visibility about what matters. And I know CQ is moving in that direction in a number of ways that I just think that's extremely, extremely important. I see it every day amongst the graduate students that I work with. And it's very, very disconcerting and very troubling to see the production or the cultivation of that type of self, And it's very difficult to resist. You have to play a certain dimension of, you cannot simply just ignore it if you're a young emerging scholar. You can't. It's career suicide. But then you can sort of all of a sudden wake up and you're sucked into this kind of horrible way of being. And that is something we really, really need to address in a realpolitik way, I think.
All right, so then I'll go on to the next question. So next question is from Sarah, who says, I'm very new to this, but do CQers go back to measuring effectiveness of the research how can they measure effectiveness of the research to demonstrate KPI, which I think are knowledge performance indicators, without being positivist, but as a way to illuminate effectiveness instead? Does anybody want to answer that one?
Can you repeat the question, or is it in chat
Yes.
somewhere?
It is in chat, but I'll repeat it again. So do CQers go back to measuring effectiveness of their research to demonstrate KPI without being positivist, but as a way to illuminate effectiveness?
Sorry, what's KPI? Sorry, I don't know what it is.
I don't know. I think
Key performance indicators.
Key performance indicators. I don't know. So what are those, Janice? What are they?
Absolutely, it's this absolute central thing that's been dominant in my faculty in this particular research committee for the last 3 years, and it starts with the H factor, and they've created these waves of expert. 3-wave expert groups that are given special money by the dean, that are given all sorts of stuff. And it's largely based on their KPI index, really their H factor, right? And these guys are like, most of them are really old white guys, like past retirement age, right? You know, and they won't leave. But not most. I mean, that the younger ones coming up are trained in the same mode, and they're mentored into this, and it's really a big deal thing. And I've been trying to sort of, and I don't know how to counter it, right? I mean, we counter it by saying, well, I don't know. I mean, it's like we counter it with metrics. I mean, what do we do to counter this? If you get a publication in Nature, it's like off the scale. If it's a publication in Science, it's off the scale. And the basic scientists have the corner on the market here. We have journals with a 1.5, maybe a 0.8 impact factor. It's all about your impact factor in your citation. It's critical in my faculty. And they see it as critical. And in fact, it's beyond my faculty because it came out in something else I was working on recently, somebody else. The prominent big guy scientists live by it, dream about it in their sleep, I'm sure. It's a really weird phenomenon, and most social scientists aren't even aware of it. But you can type it in, you can go in and look at factors, these factors, right? It's a big deal. It's a weird thing. It's a fetish, right? But it's.
So may I ask the next question? So Julia had a question. So she's wondering if the panelists can discuss benefits and challenges about CQ potentially expanding beyond the health sciences in doing or teaching health research. So, and Eric suggested geography, but perhaps there's other areas such as rhetoric, history, philosophy, etc.
Well, maybe I should say something. I just want to agree. I think that, yes, there's the proof will be in the pudding. It will depend on the types of relationships that are established and who those individuals are that form them and what they do. But I think there's, it's a challenge for CQ because it's within the School of Public Health, and it has to meet its primary audience and primary constituents. But I think there's a way of saying that meeting those needs also requires them to connect with social scientists and humanists. because that produces a more robust understanding of qualitative health research, and also creates possibilities that enhance teaching for both communities. And some of this has started, I think, with the event that's been held at York in recent year, or I guess a couple of years ago, drawing a bunch of folks together and talking about teaching qualitative health research. So I would absolutely encourage, at least in a small way, moves in that direction to see what would be possible and what could arise out of them.
Thank you. Janice or Jennifer, would either one of you like to respond to the question about expanding beyond the health sciences?
Absolutely.
Big thumbs up for me.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jack.
No, go for it. I mean, yeah, go for it. Go for it.
I was just going to say a big thumbs up for me. Obviously, in the School of Social Work, right? People often say, what's that got to do with health? And then I have to do the explanation, right? I have to help them put these things together. But it all comes back to how you understand health, right? Health is always more than health. It's the physical, the mental, the political, the structural, the social, and the spiritual, and more than that, right? And so how I can never think that health researchers would be the sole holders of knowledge about health. It has to come from multiple places, and it has to come from outside the academy, and it has to come from, knowledge holders and knowledge creators who have been told that they can't create knowledge or they don't have knowledge, right? And this takes us back to that epistemic injustice. So I say the broader the better, while as said earlier, holding the political reality, the political and funding reality of CQ is that CQ is always fighting for itself as well. In the institution, always trying to demonstrate that it's good, it's worthy, it's justifiable, and so, yeah, these two realities are always coexisting. But over to you, Janice.
I don't really have anything to say.
Well, then I would like to thank all of the panelists for all of their contributions. Both Pia and I would like to thank the panelists, and also to our virtual audience for being here and proposing such great questions. And I just wanted to pass it back to Blake to make the final remarks.
Thank you, Alisa and Pia and all the panelists for a great session, and for all of you who attended today. Just a quick teaser for our session coming up. We have one more in the series on December 4th, next Friday morning, with a keynote address from Judith Green, who is co-editor of the journal Critical Public Health, and a really lively and promising panel on critical revisions, what's next for critical qualitative health research. Please don't forget also our Padlet interactive networking and ideas board for keeping the conversation going in between and after sessions. And remember that if you arrive late or want to revisit any part of what you've heard today, a recording will be made available. And watch for a feedback survey that we'll be sending after the last session next Friday. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much.